Hello, hello, everyone. Kimsey Berkwin here. So glad to be here. I'm hopping on today to share a client success story. And I really hope that you all are able to see yourself. If you identify with Karen's story, I hope that you're able to see yourself in her story. And most importantly, imagine what life could be like if you also had these nagging symptoms resolved in 6 months. Like we're talking next, what, April? If by next spring you were feeling so much better, more energy, better sleep, better digestion, mood, weight loss, all the things, simply because the problem was actually figured out and fixed. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to share Karen's story. She was diagnosed with Hashimoto's. And so I'm going to take you through the exact path that we walked alongside her on. For those of you that don't know who I am, my name is Kimsey Berkwin. I'm an integrative nutritionist in my online nutrition and wellness practice called Progressive Health and Wellness, where I work with ambitious men and women who are struggling with their mental or physical health by taking a root caused body mind approach to optimize their overall health and wellness. I also have a little teaser that I'll share, a little special thing that's dropping next week that you'll want to make sure to come check back in on, specifically in my Facebook group, Holistic Solutions for Mental Health and Wellness. That's where I'll be sharing the details about this opportunity next week. Okay, so Karen came in to see us. It was about a year ago. Karen came in to see us about a year ago, this time last year. And she had, frankly, all the classic symptoms of Hashimoto's. She had been steadily gaining weight over the past year. She was noticing a lot more fatigue. It was starting to become hard to really get through her day, despite she would sleep long hours overnight, like 8, 9, 10 hours overnight, but it was really disrupted. So she would wake up all throughout the night, have to pee, can't go back to sleep. So it's really broken sleep. So she wasn't waking up feeling rested. She struggled with more depression, more anxiety. Her hair was starting to thin. Her nails were starting to thin. She didn't say this, but I noticed in our video call that the outer third of her eyebrows were basically non existent. And that's a big red flag for thyroid issues. And she had some achy joints. She was about 40 years old. So we recognize perimenopause may be playing into this. She still had regular menstrual cycles. They were still coming monthly. She did have very heavy menstrual cycles and some cramping leading up to the period, but no other signs, like overt signs of perimenopause. So, she had actually just been to her doctor and talked about all these problems. They ran a complete blood test, which was fine. But they ran enough data to look at the thyroid, and they included thyroid antibodies, which was great. And I believe it was the TPO, the thyroid peroxidase antibody, came back elevated. And her thyroid markers, the TSH, free T3, and free T4, were all out of whack. So it was all consistent with hypothyroidism, which was also consistent with the Hashimoto's. So the unfortunate thing is from there, the doctor just prescribed thyroid medication. I think it was levothyroxine, and said, let's wait and watch and test it in 3 months. And that was it. There was no other discussion about what to do for the actual Hashimoto's. And what I mean by that is, though that is the standard of care in conventional medicine, Hashimoto's is not true hypothyroidism. So, what I mean by that is the problem is not the thyroid itself. The problem is the immune system that's attacking the thyroid. The thyroid's essentially an innocent bystander. So, over time, you can see positive antibodies to Hashimoto's sometimes like a decade before the thyroid numbers, lab values themselves start to become skewed. So over time, the thyroid is degraded, right? Degenerates essentially. And then the hypothyroidism starts. So the thing is, though, while No autoimmune condition can be cured in the sense that once those genetics are turned on, they're turned on. They will stay on. The condition will always be kind of there, if you will, but it can be managed to such a degree that symptoms subside and lab values start to improve. Sometimes we'll see thyroid antibody counts decline to normal range. Not always. That's not always the goal, though, either. But we can see thyroid hormone levels improve. The person starts overall feeling better. They no longer have the symptoms of hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's. We see that happen all the time. And the reason I say the goal isn't necessarily for the thyroid antibodies to be at zero is because the immune system has memory. And anybody that has had mono before and tested for Epstein-Barr, right? They get mono, the doctor runs the antibodies for Epstein-Barr. There's a few different ones, I think at least 4 runs the antibodies for Epstein-Barr. Maybe at first the IgM antibodies are high, which shows like an acute recent infection. But those IgG antibodies can stay elevated for years, decades beyond the actual initial infection. So that's just an example of how the antibody presence can persist to something, or like vaccines, right? As somebody could be vaccinated to something, let's just say measles when they're like 6, and then as an adult test positive for antibodies to measles from the vaccine. So antibodies can persist, right? That's not necessarily the goal, but what we do want to look at are their thyroid lab values improving and are their symptoms improving? So with that said, with Karen, we got to work. Her symptoms, I forgot to mention too, in addition to the joint pain, she also had some constipation, bloating, some acid reflux. Mm. And then I mentioned some of the menstrual symptoms. Water kicked me. Heavy period, cramping, things like that. So after our first appointment, we sent her home with a full nutrition plan. We recommended a therapeutic diet, is what I call it. It's kind of like a paleo Mediterranean diet blend. So it takes out some of the main food antigen triggers like gluten, dairy, soy, corn, really lower sugar, no processed foods, and like limit sugars, very little, if any, processed foods. Minimally processed, fine, but no like highly processed foods. We also talked to her about protein intake. We typically recommend follow a formula. So anywhere from zero point 0.8 to 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, depending on the person's age, gender, activity level, etc. We also talked to her about meal spacing and composition. So her labs, which I'll talk about in a minute, but a preview is they did show insulin resistance. So we talked to her about starting some intermittent fasting, like I would call it more strategic fasting, where she was going like 14 hours and gradually starting to work up as tolerated to 16 hours overnight. We had her start spacing her meals and snacks by 4 to 5 hours. So she was eating at like, I think between 9 and 10 in the morning. Let me think, 1 and 2 in the afternoon, and I wanna say it was like 7 and 8, 6 and 7, something like that for dinner. So pretty like regular meal times, but we were getting in those strategic breaks so that her insulin wasn't just like popping all throughout the day. That's a big myth, by the way. We were always taught, like, way back when in nutrition school, like, eat right when you wake up, and you have to eat every 2 to 3 hours to balance your blood sugar. Like, the only animals that you see eating that frequently are the large herbivores, like cows. No other animal really eats all throughout the day, right? That's not, no. So what that actually does is it just stimulates your insulin every 2 to 3 hours. The eating first thing in the morning depends on the person. Some people want to, some people don't. I don't think it's a prerequisite. So anyways, going back to what we did with her. So that's essentially what we did nutritionally. Um, supplement. So her lab tests in our first appointment, we almost always run blood work in like leading up to that first appointment. Now, thankfully, she had that blood work done. So we just used what her doctor had run. It was enough. It was enough to get us by. And then the plan was that we would run our panel, which was a little bit more comprehensive, looked at some things that her doctor didn't, in like 3 to 4 months. So, I'm sorry, not 3 to 4, sorry, 4 to 6 months later. So we also noted low vitamin D was in like the 20s, which is pretty low. Low ferritin. So iron deficiency, essentially, her ferritin was at like 22. And iron is very, very important for thyroid hormone function. So then we like thyroid hormone production, the immune system, energy, etc. So you have to ask why when you see iron low, especially in someone that is eating iron food sources. That's what we'll talk about her stool test. So her iron was low, or her ferritin was low at 22, and she had low B vitamins. Her homocysteine was also low. And I think this doctor ran B12, which was at like 300. B12, just testing B12 in the blood isn't the best way to test for B12. It's better to test methylmalonic acid, which is basically a organic acid that B12 influences, the levels influence. So, anyways, nonetheless, when just straight up B12 is tested, I want to see it above 500. So below 300, or I'm sorry, in the 300s was, not ideal. So low, and then high homocysteine, so low folate, kind of deduced B6. So, and then, like I said, the insulin resistance, her hemoglobin A1C was 5.8. Her triglycerides were elevated. So she showed some pretty, and I think her fasting glucose was like 93 or something, 94, and I want to see it below 90. So, those were the main things that we were focusing on from the blood work. So, supplements in that first appointment, we gave her a pretty basic protocol. We started with a medical food. I use these all the time. There's different ones, but a medical food comes in the form of a plant based protein shake that contains a full multivitamin that also has nutrients to support detoxification, inflammation, and gut health. So it's like a functional food, essentially. And it's like 4 products in one. I pretty much always want people having protein at breakfast. And so this makes that really easy too. And some people that don't necessarily respond well to oral supplements will sometimes respond better to these medical foods. So we used that. I think I had her doing 10,000 IU of vitamin D for like 2 weeks to start as a loading dose, and then reduced to 5,000 IU to maintain. We did 150 micrograms of additional selenium, and then I encouraged her to eat Brazil nuts regularly too. We also did omega-3 fatty acids. Nordic Naturals makes this awesome, it's called omega curcumin, and it's one of my favorite products. It's omega-3s, but it also has glutathione and curcumin in it. So it's great for inflammation and detox support. I think that's it. I think that's what we started with. So then we sent her, and magnesium glycinate. That was it. We also included magnesium glycinate for the constipation and the insomnia. So we sent her home with a stool test, a GI map stool test. And when I say sent her home, I mean we shipped the kit to her, right? My business is all online. I have clients all over the world. So we can send testing to wherever you are. So we sent her the GI map stool test. And when we met for our follow-up appointment 3 weeks later, we had the stool test results in, and we also checked in to see how she's doing. She was following the supplement protocol. She was following the nutrition plan. For the most part, like she'd done really well with gluten and dairy. Obviously sugar sneaks in. She's doing much better with this meal spacing. So in that first check-in appointment, she had already noticed meaningful improvements. She was sleeping better. She was having more like daily bowel movements. They weren't sufficient still, but they were daily and before she was skipping. Her anxiety had reduced. She had lost, I think, like 5 pounds or so, 5, 6 pounds. Um, her joints didn't ache anymore. Those were some of the big, and she didn't have as much brain fog. Those were some of the biggest improvements that she had noticed. So she described it as like 40 to 50% improvement just in those 3 weeks from like basically nutrition changes. I had also recommended that she get outside for walks daily and do like 5 minutes of box pattern breathing in the morning. So there were some like light lifestyle things that she was getting in, a few times a week at least. Um, so then we look at her stool test, and her stool test showed the most meaningful things that it showed were H. pylori, which explained the bloating and the acid reflux. It also showed um, general dysbiosis, is what I would call it. So she said had some low beneficial bacteria, like some of the keystones, like Faecilibacterium prausnitzii and Akkermansia muciniphila. Like they're really important for butyrate production, for mucosal lining protection. And then she had some elevated opportunistic microbes, Streptococcus, Staphylococcus, which almost always goes hand in hand with H. pylori. So there was protein maldigestion. She also had elevated Pseudomonas species. So there were like 4 different opportunist species that were elevated. And then she had low pancreatic enzyme output, which would also, like the H. pylori will contribute to that. And that the low enzyme output will also contribute to the constipation and bloating. And she had low secretory IgA. So suppressed, depressed immune system in the digestive tract, essentially, which can happen with prolonged issues. Also with like stress, poor diet, antibiotics, other medications. But that's like the first line of defense in the digestive tract. That's like the army, essentially, of the digestive tract. So if the army's on vacation, it's going to leave you susceptible to these opportunistic overgrowths like H. pylori and the other species I've mentioned. So then we get her started on a protocol to fix these issues. So we keep the supplements that we had already. I think, no, yeah, we keep the supplements that we had already and add in I love the product Gastromend. Gastromend is wonderful for H. pylori. Sometimes I'll combine that with something called Pyloguard. So Gastromend is your classic like DGL and mastic gum and vitamin C and MSM and like, so it's pylori fighting, but also stomach environment supportive. Pyloguard is a strain of, I believe it's Lactobacillus reuteri. Don't fact check me on that. It might be a different one, but I think it's reuteri. That produces postbiotics that bind to H. pylori in the stomach and essentially like eliminate it. So it's a totally different approach, very gentle approach, but it can work really well, especially when combined with, your more traditional antimicrobial. So that's what we did in her case. And we added in a pancreatic enzyme support. And for the first 30 days, that's all we did to start. I don't like adding in HCl, hydrochloric acid, right off the bat, especially when H. pylori is present, because sometimes the stomach's just too inflamed and they don't respond well to it. The person doesn't respond well to it. So we didn't. So we another digestive enzyme that I really like in those cases is by therapeutic, I think it's Therapeutic Labs, and it is called Simile Sensitive Stomach. That one's great because it has no protease, but it also has like DGL and aloe and the rest of the enzyme, like broad spectrum enzyme blend. So it can be really soothing for an inflamed stomach. So we did that for 30 days. We continued along with all the other nutrition things that we were doing. And I had her slowly phase out. The bottle of selenium that she bought had was a 60 count. So I had her buy one bottle. Let's do a loading dose of selenium, ditch that bottle when you run out, and just eat Brazil nuts. So at least like 6 Brazil nuts daily will get you a therapeutic dose, above a therapeutic dose of selenium. So so that's what she did. So we did that for 30 days. Then we moved into a more kind of broad spectrum gut toning protocol for the other forms of dysbiosis, the Pseudomonas, the Streptococcus. Different practitioners take different approaches on opportunists like that. I typically tend to be, it depends on what comes back in the person's symptoms. I typically tend to be a little bit more aggressive with those. Um, because I seem to get the best results when I bring in antimicrobials. So other practitioners support just like building up the good microbiome. I get that. This is just my personal take. In this case, we used Cellcore. We used Cellcore Para 1 and Para 2. And sometimes I stop there. Sometimes I do all of the Cellcore protocol depending on how they, again, how they respond. So in her case, we just did Para 1 and Para 2 for 30 days. And at the end of that 2-month period of the full gut focused protocol, that's when we really saw the most significant benefit. So we're about 3 months in at this point, and she was really noticing much less, no bloating, no acid reflux. She was having daily bowel movements that felt sufficient. She had lost at that point about 10 pounds, didn't have the achiness in her joints. She was sleeping well. She didn't have the anxiety or depression. She described it as she had improved by about 70%, which is really what we look for. It's like a benchmark. I want clients to improve by that much at least, if not more. So like I said, that was about the 3 to 4 month mark that she noticed those improvements. So at that point, we ran a hormone test. Her hormone symptoms had mostly improved, but we did run a hormone test, just a salivary hormone test. And it showed low progesterone primarily, which kind of made sense given the history. So inflammation, nutrient deficiencies, those can really impact progesterone levels. So her breasts were no longer sensitive, and she was having normal heaviness of periods, but she still had some of the cramping leading up to the period. And so we just did some kind of basic progesterone support. We talked a lot more about lifestyle, walking outside in nature, breath work in the morning, and then added in Vitex and Dong Quai and some more adaptogens and things to help the stress response and help progesterone production. And that's what carries us through to the last of the 6 months. And that's where hormone support tends to take a little bit longer, especially progesterone. I give that at least 3 months before I expect to see meaningful, consistent changes in the menstrual cycle. Plus, I mean, you only get a period a month. So you only have one opportunity really to check to see how things are improving there. But nonetheless, it was starting to improve, and that's where we landed. And so after 6 months, we started to move her into a maintenance supplement protocol, which is for me typically multivitamin, fish oil, vitamin D, sometimes magnesium, and maintenance lifestyle, diet. I coach them on how to navigate that themselves. So what I mean by that is some people by the end of 6 months are ready to introduce gluten or dairy or foods like that back in. With Hashimoto's, I pretty much recommend gluten-free for life. I still recommend introducing it so they know how it makes them feel. But for the most part, because of that molecular mimicry, I generally recommend avoiding gluten 90% of the time. Dairy can come back in. Corn and soy, I look at as when in Rome items. So don't just like eat your corn chips as your snack. If you're sitting at home by yourself, but like if you go to a Mexican food restaurant or something with friends and want some corn chips or, tortillas or something, then go for it. Anyways, so coached her on how to navigate that. So, how to introduce foods back in, when to know if those foods are able to come back in or not, and what that process looks like. So that is Karen's story in a nutshell. And I will say her story was quite straightforward. Not everyone's is, right? Not everyone's is. Some people have more complicated things going on. For some people, our gut focus protocol is 4 months, right? They might have more significant hormonal imbalances. They might have histamine intolerance. So I'm not going to paint this blue sky and be like, everyone's fixed in 6 months. But I will say, like, it happens, right? It happens. And had Karen not taken those steps, she would have taken thyroid medication and continued feeling like crap because the inflammation was still going on and her thyroid was just worsening over the years. So, that is my message to you. Imagine where you could be, like I said, next April if you took this path, if you invested in your health, if you invested in working with someone that can really help you navigate the process. So stay tuned. Like I said, we have a big, like, exciting news that's dropping next week. If you've been sitting on the fence, if you watch all my content, you're like, maybe one day next week could be a really great opportunity for you. So stay tuned there. And in the meantime, I always offer free 15-minute discovery calls. They almost always go 30 minutes. I say 15, but I offer free discovery calls. So you can schedule that. I'll drop the link in my website, but you can schedule that directly on these videos or on my website, progressivehealthandwellness.com. And it just gives us a chance to talk more about some of the health challenges that you're having, what you're looking for, how I can help, what the next steps would look like. And if it feels like a good fit, then we'll talk about how to get started. And if not, that's okay too. So, thank you everyone for being here. Again, check my private Facebook group next week. That's where the news is dropping next Tuesday. That Facebook group is Holistic Solutions for Mental Health and Wellness. And I hope to see you there. Okay, have a great rest of your day. Bye.